I was 29 and living in an apartment on the third floor of an older building on the north side of Columbus. The rent was cheap, the kitchen was small, and the walls were thin enough that I could usually tell when the guy downstairs was watching a movie because I could hear the bass through my bedroom floor. I stayed there. It was affordable and close enough to work. My job involved driving around to different apartment complexes during the day, dealing with tenants, checking units, and handling whatever small problems came up. Some days were busy enough that I barely had time to eat. Other days were mostly spent sitting in my truck outside a property because someone wasn't home and I was waiting for them to call me back. I'd been doing it for about 3 years. My life outside work was pretty ordinary. My parents still lived in the house where I'd grown up, about 30 minutes outside the city. My older sister Paisley lived closer to me with her husband and their 2 kids, so I'd see her fairly often. Usually that meant dinner, helping her husband move something heavy, or listening to her complain about one of the kids breaking something expensive. I was also seeing a woman named Rachel, although I wouldn't have called it a serious relationship. We'd been going out for a few months, but our schedules didn't line up very well. She worked evenings, and I started work early, so there were weeks where we barely saw each other. Then there was Roy. I'd known Roy since high school. We'd gone through periods where we were inseparable, and other periods where we could go a month without seeing each other. Neither of us took it personally. Whenever we did get together, we'd usually pick up exactly where we'd left off. Roy was the kind of person who could talk to anybody. He'd have a 10-minute conversation with a cashier while I stood beside him wondering how we'd somehow gotten onto the subject of somebody's brother's divorce. He talked to people at gas stations, restaurants, stores, pretty much anywhere. He was also terrible at answering his phone. I could call him 3 times during the day and get nothing. Then he'd call me at 11 at night and act like there was nothing unusual about it. He was always doing something with his car, too. He had a dark blue 2007 Mustang that was constantly breaking down, although he loved that thing more than almost anything else he owned. He'd send me pictures of parts he'd bought online and expect me to understand what I was looking at. I never did. I'd usually respond with, "Looks good." Then he'd send another picture. "Look at the difference." Yeah, huge difference. I couldn't have told you what had changed between the 2 pictures if somebody had offered me money. That was our friendship. I'd get home around 5 or 6, make dinner, and go to bed before midnight because I had to be up early. I liked it that way. Nothing dramatic was happening in my life, which is why I remember the period so clearly. It was a weekday. I'd gotten home a little after 6, made something, and watched an episode of a show I'd been following. At some point around 7, Roy texted me asking if I wanted to come over that weekend. He'd bought new speakers for his Mustang. I told him I'd probably stop by Saturday. He replied, "Probably?" I sent back, "Yeah, probably." He sent a thumbs down emoji. That was the last message we exchanged. Around 9, I called my mother because she'd left me a voicemail earlier. She wanted to know if I was coming over for dinner Sunday. We talked for like 10 minutes before I told her I needed to shower. Afterward, I cleaned the kitchen and sat on the couch with my laptop. I wasn't planning on going to bed yet. At some point, I looked at the clock and saw that it was after 11. After that, things get strange. The next clear memory I have is hearing someone knock on my apartment door. My building had thin walls, and people occasionally knocked on the wrong apartment. There was also a guy on my floor who came home drunk often enough that I wouldn't have been surprised if he'd forgotten where he lived again. I got off the couch and walked to the door. Before I reached it, the knocking came again. I looked through the hole. Roy was standing outside. He looked like he'd been outside in terrible weather. His hair was completely soaked and stuck against his forehead. Water ran from the ends of it down the sides of his face. His shirt was dark from being wet, and his jeans were soaked around the knees and lower legs. His shoes were covered in mud. I opened the door. "Dude, what happened?" He looked at me. He didn't answer. There was something off about his expression. Looked exhausted, like he'd been awake for several days. Then he said my name. I don't remember exactly what came after that. I stepped aside and let him in. Water was dripping from his clothes onto the floor. I remember looking down at his shoes because there were small pieces of mud stuck around the soles. "Did you get into an accident?" He shook his head. "Where's your car?" "Nothing." I looked back at him. "Roy?" He finally answered. "No." The word came out slowly. His voice itself sounded normal. It wasn't slurred, and he didn't sound drunk. The strange part was the amount of time between my questions and his answers. I'd ask something, and he'd stare at me for a few seconds before responding. "You okay?" He looked at me. A few seconds passed. "Yeah." I laughed. "You look like absolute hell." There was a small smile on his face. At least I think there was. Even now, I'm not sure whether that's something I actually saw or something my memory added later. He told me he needed to talk to me. So we sat down in the living room. I don't know how long we were there. There are pieces of the conversation that I can still remember, but they don't fit together very well. He asked how work was going. I told him it was fine. He asked about Rachel. I told him we weren't really seeing each other anymore. He nodded. Then he asked whether I'd talked to his mother recently. I told him I hadn't. That was followed by a long silence. He sat there looking down at the floor. "Seriously, Roy? What's wrong?" He looked up. "Don't tell anybody I came here." I thought he was joking. "What?" "Don't tell anybody I came here." "Why?" He didn't answer. I asked if he needed money. "No." "Did you get into a fight?" "No." "Is somebody after you?" "No." Every answer was the same, short, slow, detached. It was getting close to midnight and I had work the next morning. And my best friend had shown up at my apartment soaking wet and apparently had no intention of explaining why. I asked if he wanted me to drive him somewhere. "No." He stood up. That part of the memory is unusually clear. He was standing in the middle of my living room with water still darkening his clothes. His face looked exhausted, but I couldn't see any obvious injury. There was no blood, no bruising, nothing that would have explained why he'd arrived looking like that. I asked him again if he was sure he didn't need a ride. He said something. I couldn't understand it. "What?" He repeated himself. The words still didn't make sense. I remember staring at him and trying to work out what he was saying. His voice had become even quieter. Eventually he stopped trying. He walked toward the door. I followed him. "At least call me when you get home." He didn't answer. He opened the apartment door. I stood there as he stepped into the hallway. Then the door closed. That's the last clear memory I have of actually being with him. The next morning, I woke up around 6:30. My phone was sitting on the nightstand. There were missed calls. 2 were from numbers I didn't recognize. The others were from Paisley. I called her back. She answered and was upset. "Are you sitting down?" I remember being annoyed by the question. "What happened? Have you heard from Roy?" "Yeah, he came over last night." "What do you mean?" "He came to my apartment." She didn't say anything. Then I heard her start crying. I sat up in bed. "Paisley?" She took a breath. "Roy's dead." For a few seconds I thought I'd heard her wrong. "What?" "He died last night." I stared at the wall. "No, I just talked to him." She told me there had been an accident on a rural road outside Columbus. His Mustang had left the road, hit a tree, and rolled. He'd been pronounced dead at the scene. The accident had happened around 10:30. I was sitting on my bed with the phone pressed against my ear, trying to make the times fit together. They didn't. I told Paisley again that Roy had come to my apartment. She didn't argue with me. She just asked me where I was. I said I was home. Then she asked me to check the apartment. I walked into the living room. There was no water on the floor, no muddy footprints, nothing. For the first time, I wondered if I'd dreamed the whole thing. I'd fallen asleep on the couch. I was tired. Maybe I'd had some incredibly vivid dream and carried pieces of it into waking life. The hallway camera. The apartment building had security cameras in the hallways. The property management company I worked for handled the building, so I had access to the footage. I opened the recording from outside my apartment. The timestamp read 11:47 p.m. The footage showed me walking toward the door. I opened it. Then I stopped. I could see myself looking straight ahead. My mouth was moving. I was talking to somebody, but there was nobody there. I watched the recording again. The hallway was empty. There was no person standing outside my door, no shadow disappearing around the corner, no movement at the edge of the frame. Nothing. I thought Roy had been standing somewhere the camera couldn't see. I checked the camera angle. It covered almost the entire hallway. There wasn't anywhere directly in front of my door where somebody could stand without appearing on the recording. I watched myself step backward. The movement was obvious. I was making room for someone to enter. Then I stood there talking to empty space. At one point, I even laughed. That bothered me. I didn't remember laughing. I watched the footage a few more times. Every time it showed the same thing. Me opening the door, me talking, me listening, me stepping backward, me closing the door. Nobody else. Then I checked the weather. I remembered Roy being completely soaked. It had rained earlier that evening, but the rain had stopped. His accident had happened at approximately 10:30. The police report later confirmed that his car had been sitting in the ditch for some time before another driver found him. He'd already been dead for more than an hour when I opened my apartment door. I didn't tell my family what I thought had happened. When Paisley asked about it again, I told her I must have been half asleep. That explanation was easier. It was also the only explanation I had. I went to Roy's funeral a few days later. His mother asked when I'd last spoken to him. I told her the day before. I didn't tell her what happened at my apartment. I couldn't bring myself to. She just lost her son. Telling her that I believed he'd somehow come to my apartment after he died felt cruel, even if I believed every word of it. The camera footage. I'd watched it so many times that I could practically see the sequence without looking. If I imagined him, then my brain somehow created an entire conversation with a person who had already been dead for more than an hour. I didn't simply dream about seeing him. I remember answering questions. I remember getting annoyed with him. It felt like a conversation. And if I didn't imagine him, then I have no idea who I was talking to. I don't think I'll ever know. I moved to Michigan after taking a job. The move was mostly because of the job. My old apartment lease was ending, the new position paid better, and I could work from home 3 days a week. I didn't have some big plan to start over in Michigan. It just seemed like a good opportunity, and I figured moving somewhere new for a better job wasn't a huge decision at that point in my life. I rented a small townhouse in a quiet development on the northeast side of the city. It had 2 bedrooms, 1.5 bathrooms, a tiny backyard, and an attached garage. The neighborhood was newer, but there were older houses around the edges where the development met the established parts of town. I also had my dog Tim. I'd adopted him from a shelter a few years earlier, and he was about 6 years old when we moved. He's a golden retriever mix, although I've never been able to figure out exactly what the other half is. He looked enough like a golden retriever that most people just assumed that's what he was. Tim was also the reason I got to know the neighborhood so quickly. He needed to be walked every evening, whether I felt like going out or not. There was a paved trail about 10 minutes from my townhouse that followed a creek and connected few neighborhoods. It wasn't a hiking trail. People used it for walking their dogs, jogging, riding bikes, and getting some fresh air after work. I started taking Tim there almost every evening. After a few weeks, I began recognizing some of the regulars. I never spoke to most of them, but seeing the same people over and over made them familiar. The trail eventually passed a section where the houses were much older than the ones around my townhouse. They had bigger yards, mature trees, and old wooden porches. One house in particular stood right beside the trail. It was a 2-story gray house with dark shutters and a wide front porch. A large maple tree stood in the front yard, and a chain-link fence separated the property from the trail. I noticed the house because Tim always slowed down there. He wasn't afraid of it. He would just stop near the fence and sniff along the bottom for a while. Sometimes I'd give the leash a little tug and tell him to come on, and he'd follow me. I never really thought about the people who lived in the house. I don't remember seeing anyone outside, although I may have noticed lights through the windows once or twice. I walked past it so often that the house eventually became part of the scenery. My first few months in Michigan were pretty good. My sister lived about an hour away and came over during my first weekend to help me unpack. She spent most of the afternoon complaining about how many books I'd brought with me. My parents came over once during the first month too. My mother asked whether I liked the neighborhood, whether work was going well, and whether I'd met anybody yet. I told her everything was fine. I wasn't unhappy. I just hadn't really built much of a life there. Most of my social interaction came from work. Most evenings, I'd finish work, clean up, take Tim for his walk, and then spend an hour or two watching television before going to bed. The trail became part of that routine without me really noticing. It was one of the few places I went every day where I wasn't thinking about work. The evening. I'd spent most of the afternoon dealing with a customer. It wasn't a serious problem, but it had taken few hours to sort out, and by the time I finished, I was pretty irritated. Tim was waiting by the back door. It was around 7 when we left. The weather was comfortable, and the sun was already getting low. We walked for about 20 minutes before reaching the older houses. Tim slowed down when we reached the gray house. I gave the leash a small tug and told him to come on, but he stayed there with his nose close to the bottom of the fence. I was looking down at him when a woman's voice came from the other side. "You have a beautiful dog." I looked up and saw an elderly woman standing a few feet away. She looked somewhere in her 70s or 80s. She had short gray hair and wore a light-colored cardigan over a simple blouse. She wasn't standing on the porch. She was right beside the fence, close enough that we were only separated by a few feet of chain link. I was slightly surprised because I hadn't noticed her there as we'd approached. "Thanks," I said. She smiled at Tim. She laughed. "He looks exactly like mine." Tim had moved closer to the fence while we were talking. The woman crouched slightly and held out her hand. He went straight toward her. That was unusual enough to catch my attention. Tim was friendly, but he normally didn't show much interest in strangers. He'd sniff someone's hand and then go back to whatever he was doing. With this woman, he seemed completely comfortable. Then she stood up. Buddy was just like him. I assumed she meant Buddy had died. She started telling me about him, and the conversation became more detailed than I expected. It was an oddly specific conversation for two strangers, but she seemed perfectly normal. She sounded like someone who still missed a dog she'd had years ago. I asked whether she had another dog. She shook her head. No. There was something about the way she said it that made me stop smiling. She gave a quiet laugh before looking back at me. "You came back." I wasn't sure what she meant. "What? You came back?" I thought she was talking about Tim. She kept looking at me. Her expression was strange, but not in a threatening way. She didn't look angry. If anything, she looked relieved. I looked toward the house. Most of the curtains were closed, although one of the upstairs windows had a narrow gap between them. The yard was extremely well maintained. There were flowers planted around the porch, and the grass had clearly been cut recently. I'd walked past that house dozens of times, but I couldn't remember ever noticing someone outside before. The woman reached through the fence and touched Tim's head. He didn't react. She kept her hand there for a few seconds, gently rubbing his fur. Something changed in me while I was standing there. I can't describe it particularly well because I didn't feel sick or dizzy. My body simply became extremely heavy. My arms and legs felt like they had suddenly lost their strength, and even keeping my eyes open started taking effort. I blinked a few times. Tim's collar made a soft metallic sound beside me. The woman said something, but I couldn't make out the words. Then there is a complete gap in my memory. I don't remember falling. I don't remember feeling dizzy or hitting the pavement. There was no sensation of slowly passing out. The next thing I remember is opening my eyes inside an ambulance. A paramedic was leaning over me. "Can you tell me your name?" I gave it to him. "Do you know where you are?" I looked around the ambulance and shook my head. "No." "You're in an ambulance. You fainted." I was confused by that. "I fainted?" "Yeah." The first thing I thought about was Tim. "Where's my dog?" The paramedic told me Tim was okay. "Where is he?" "He's with another person right now. He's fine." I tried to sit up, but the paramedic told me to stay where I was. He explained that another person walking the trail had found me unconscious on the ground. Tim had been standing beside me and apparently refused to leave. The person called 911, and the ambulance arrived a short time later. I asked how long I'd been unconscious. They weren't sure. That bothered me because I still couldn't remember collapsing. The The last thing I could clearly place was standing beside the fence talking to the woman. After that, nothing. At the hospital, they ran few tests. Nothing obvious came back. The doctor explained that people faint for a lot of different reasons, and that sometimes there isn't an immediate explanation. I told him I'd been talking to someone immediately before I passed out. An older woman? Yeah. What happened with her? I don't know. He asked whether she'd been with me when I collapsed. I told him I assumed she had. The next day, I contacted the man who had found me. I wanted to know exactly what he'd seen. He told me he'd been walking his own dog when he noticed me lying on the trail. Tim was standing beside me and wouldn't leave. I asked whether he'd seen the woman. What woman? The woman at the gray house. He said he hadn't seen anyone. I asked whether he'd noticed somebody standing by the fence. No, I described her anyway. Gray hair, light cardigan, older woman. He still said there hadn't been anyone there. I figured he simply hadn't noticed her. For the next few days, I stopped taking Tim on the trail. My sister was more worried about the whole thing than I was. She came over one Saturday and told me I should get checked out again. I'm fine. You passed out for no reason. I know. That's not the same thing as fine. The doctors hadn't found anything, and I eventually went back to work. For a while, Tim and I walked around the neighborhood instead. Nothing happened, and after a few weeks, I got tired of avoiding the trail. I'd walked it almost every day since moving there, and I didn't want one strange incident to turn it into a place I was afraid to go. So I took Tim back. It had been around 3 weeks. People were walking, a couple of kids were riding bikes, and someone was jogging toward us from the other direction. Everything seemed normal until we reached the older houses. I looked toward the gray house and immediately noticed that the yard didn't look right. The flowers were dead. The grass had grown long, and the place had the neglected appearance of a property nobody had touched in months. There was a notice taped to the front door. I stopped for a moment. Tim went straight toward the fence and started sniffing around the bottom rail. A man was working in the yard of the house next door, so I walked over and asked him. He looked toward the gray house. The old woman died. I asked when. He thought about it for a moment. Few years back, I think. I told him I'd thought someone had been living there recently. He shook his head. No. House has been empty for a while. I laughed. I thought he was messing with me. I explained what happened. I told him about meeting the woman by the fence, the conversation we'd had about Buddy, and the fact that I'd passed out afterward. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he looked toward the house again. The woman who owned that house died about 20 years ago. I didn't know how to respond to that. He said he'd lived next door for more than 15 years and knew the house had been empty for most of that time. Her husband had passed away years earlier, and she eventually died alone in the house. The property had apparently been sitting there because of some dispute over ownership. I asked whether somebody had renovated the house or checked on it regularly. He said no. I still live in Michigan, although I moved to another part of the area a couple of years later. Tim is older now and doesn't like long walks as much as he used to, so our walks are much shorter. I've told my sister the story a few times, but she doesn't believe I actually spoke to someone who had been dead for 20 years. And that woman, I still don't understand what she meant when she looked at me and said, "You came back." I don't remember ever meeting her, yet she seemed to know me. I've never been able to recover the missing part of that evening. I've wondered whether passing out simply erased the moments around it, but sometimes I think about the way she spoke to me and wonder if there was something else going on. But the conversation felt real. I remember the house, the fence, Tim standing beside me, and the woman's hand resting on his head. I remember the way she talked about Buddy and how familiar she seemed with him. Most of all, I remember the expression on her face when she told me I'd come back. It wasn't the expression of somebody meeting a stranger. It was the expression of somebody seeing a person she'd been waiting for. The property still exists. I don't know whether anyone lives there now, and I've never gone back to check. I don't think I want to. Before that evening, I never believed in ghosts. I wouldn't say I was strongly against the idea. It just wasn't something I'd ever spent much time thinking about. I was living with my parents again for a few months while I figured out what I was doing. My brother, Daniel, was away at college at the time. He was living in a dorm about 2 hours from home, so the house felt different without him around. He wasn't somebody I was especially close to when we were younger, but we had gotten along better once we were both out of high school. He'd call me to complain about his roommates, or ask if Mom had said anything about him coming home for the weekend. My parents lived in a quiet part of the area, outside a town where we'd been for most of my childhood. It wasn't the kind of neighborhood where you saw people walking around at night. Most of the houses had decent-sized yards. There were a couple of farms a few minutes away. I had moved back in with my parents after a job I had in Pittsburgh fell through. I was working part-time at a store while applying for other jobs, which wasn't exactly what I'd pictured myself doing, but I wasn't miserable about it. I was saving money, helping my parents with groceries when I could, and trying to figure out whether I wanted to go back to school. My dad usually left the house around 6 in the morning. Mom worked 3 days a week. She was the kind of person who went to bed early and woke up early, while my dad could stay up watching television until midnight, without having any problem getting out of bed the next morning. I was the opposite. I stayed up late constantly. I would play games on my computer, watch movies, or sit downstairs with my headphones on after everybody else went to bed. My mom complained about it because I was always tired the next day, but I was convinced I could function perfectly fine on 5 hours of sleep. There was another thing about the house that I should explain. My parents' bedroom was at the end of the upstairs hallway. Daniel's bedroom was across from it. My old bedroom was downstairs because my parents had turned it into a storage room after I moved out. When I moved back, I slept in the basement guest room instead, so if I was upstairs late at night, I normally had a reason to be there. Getting a drink, using the bathroom, looking for something in the kitchen, whatever. Daniel's room had basically been left alone while he was at college. My mom would go in there to vacuum and occasionally collect laundry he'd left behind, but otherwise, nobody used it. There were still posters on the wall, his old desk was covered with random stuff, and his bed hadn't been made properly since he'd left. He had one of those cheap dark wooden dressers that he'd had since he was a kid, and there was a small lamp on the nightstand. I mention all of this because I knew that room extremely well. I'd grown up in that house. I knew what every doorway looked like at night. I knew which floorboards creaked. I knew where the light from the hallway hit the carpet outside Daniel's room. I also knew my mother sometimes went into that room late at night if she'd forgotten something. That's why, when I saw somebody standing inside it at around 2 in the morning, my first thought wasn't anything strange. It was just Mom. I had gotten home from work around 6, ate dinner with my parents, and spent the evening downstairs. My dad had gone to bed a little after 10 because he had work early. My mom stayed up for another half hour watching television. I remember her asking me if I was going to work the next morning. I told her I wasn't sure because my manager hadn't put me on the schedule yet. She said something about how I needed to stop waiting for people to call me and start calling them myself. That was pretty typical of my mom. I played on my computer for a while. I think I was watching some videos afterward because I remember taking my headphones off and realizing the house was quiet. I looked at the clock on my computer. It was like 1:47 a.m. I decided I should probably go to bed. Before going downstairs, I went upstairs to get a glass of water. I didn't really need to, but I always did that before going to sleep. The kitchen was on the first floor, so I walked down the hallway toward the stairs. My parents' bedroom door was closed. As I passed Daniel's room, I noticed the door was open. My mom had probably gone in there earlier and forgotten to close it. I could see into the room, and I saw this woman. She was standing beside Daniel's bed. Her back was toward me. I stopped. The first thing I saw was her hair. It was dark and came down around her shoulders. She was wearing something like a nightgown or a loose shirt. From behind, she looked like my mother. My mother had dark hair that she usually kept around shoulder length, and she wore loose clothes around the house at night. So my immediate assumption was that she'd gotten up for some reason. I almost said, "Mom?" I stood there for a second. She was looking toward the far side of Daniel's room. I couldn't see what she was looking at because she had her back to me. I was confused. Took a couple of steps closer. The woman still didn't move. I said quietly, "Mom?" She turned around, and I don't know how to explain what happened in my head when I saw her face. It wasn't a distorted face. It wasn't pale or bloody or anything like that. It was just a woman's face, a normal face. But I knew her. It was Mrs. Harlan. She had been a family friend when I was a kid. I hadn't seen her in years. She had died when I was around 14. I don't remember what I said when I saw her. I don't think I said anything. I stood there. She was probably in her late 40s when she died. She had dark brown hair, a narrow face, and these very noticeable eyebrows that my brother used to make fun of when we were kids. I'd known her because she and my mother had been friends for years. She lived about 10 minutes away from us, and when I was younger, she would come over for dinner sometimes. Our families had gone to cookouts together. She'd been at my parents' house for birthdays and holidays. I remembered her laughing in our kitchen. I remembered her calling me Buddy, even when I was old enough to think it was embarrassing. She had died years earlier. There was no question about that. I knew she'd died because I'd gone to the funeral. I remember my mother crying afterward. I remember not really knowing how to react to seeing an adult I'd known my entire childhood lying in a coffin. And then years later, I was standing 10 feet away from her in my brother's bedroom. She looked at me. I don't know if she recognized me. She just looked at me. I backed away. I remember grabbing the door handle. Dad woke up because I must have made a lot of noise. I said, "There's somebody in Daniel's room." Dad was immediately awake. He asked, "What?" I said, "There's a woman in Daniel's room." Mom looked at me and said, "What woman?" I told her I thought it was her at first. My dad got out of bed. He wasn't scared at that point. He asked me if I'd locked the doors. I said yes. He told me to stay behind him. We walked down the hallway. I was right behind him. The door to Daniel's room was still open. Nobody was standing there. The room was empty. Dad walked inside and checked behind the door, inside the closet, and under the bed. There was nobody there. He opened the window. It was locked. He checked the hallway window. I said, "She looked like Mrs. Harlan." My mom didn't answer. She stared at me. My dad came out of the room and said, "Who?" I repeated the name. He looked at my mother. That was the first moment when I realized this wasn't something I was going to be able to explain away as me seeing somebody who looked similar. My parents both knew exactly who I meant. My mom said, "You mean Linda?" I nodded. She looked shaken. My dad asked me if I'd been drinking. I hadn't taken anything. I wasn't sick. I wasn't tired. I'd been awake late, but I was completely alert when it happened. The weirdest part was that Linda wasn't somebody I'd been thinking about. I hadn't talked about her recently, hadn't looked at pictures of her. I hadn't even really thought about her in years. She was just somebody from my childhood who had died. Mom asked me why I would see her. I told her I didn't know. She asked me if Linda had said anything. I said no. She walked into Daniel's room. I stayed in the hallway. She stood there for a while looking at the bed. Then she turned off the lamp. We all went downstairs. Dad made coffee even though it was nearly 3 in the morning. Mom told me she'd slept in Daniel's room because I was younger and had been sharing the downstairs room with my brother at the time. It just made the image in my head feel more connected to the house. Dad didn't believe any of it was supernatural. I knew the basic story, but I hadn't remembered the details. Linda had gotten sick unexpectedly. She'd been in the hospital for a while, then died. There wasn't anything mysterious about it. There wasn't some unfinished business that my mother knew about. She'd simply died. Mom told me she'd sometimes dreamed about her after the funeral, but she had never seen her awake. That was the only time she ever admitted anything like that.